With that, I think we're ready to start with our first speaker. Good. We have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh ready to go in New Delhi. He is the founder and also CEO of this think tank called the Council of Energy, Environment, and Water. He founded it more than a decade ago and has risen now to become one of the top 20 think tanks on climate change around the world. And he has previously worked at Princeton, at Oxford, at the UNDP, at the WTO, and today as an important partner of the government of India in developing climate change policies, has also had a seat at the table in shaping Indian policies. So we are delighted that Dr. Arunabha Ghosh is able to join us. He really did want to come here in person. When I extended the invitation to him in Delhi in person, he looked forward to attending in person, and for a while it looked as if he might be able to pull it off, but in the end, it wasn't possible. But very appreciative of the fact that late in the evening, in Delhi time, he has made time to speak to us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, are you there?
Yes, I hope you can hear.
Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Ramamurthy. Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone in Boston. As you were rightly concluding, I was very much looking forward to being there in person, and I'm trying really hard to organize my travel accordingly. Unfortunately, there were some important government briefings here that I could not miss, so I'm missing you in person. Just by a few days. It's been a few days later I could have made it. But in any case, I look forward to visiting the campus sooner or later. Thank you also for organizing this conference and for inviting me to kick off the proceedings. As you rightly indicated in your opening remarks, India is one of the many emerging economies where a lot of these issues will play out. So in my presentation, I wanted to highlight the sort of balancing act that India is trying to play between the energy changes in its energy system, the imperatives of economic growth that India continues to have, but also the quality of life of citizens as we grow and as we seek a better quality of life. So that'll be really the theme of what I present to you over the next 20 minutes or so. I believe that someone out there is controlling the slides, so if I could request you to move on to the next one. I represent the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. As it was just introduced, we are one of the leading climate think tanks in the world, ranked among the top 20. We're a 14-year-old institution, and our ambition is to impact sustainable development at scale with data, integrated and interdisciplinary analysis, and strategic outreach. As the slide shows, our work centers around system-level transformations, whether it's in the economy as a whole, how we are plotting the low-carbon pathways for India and for many states within India, but also the energy system, the industrial system. But in a place like India, you can't do this without thinking about jobs and livelihoods. We also have a big focus around the kind of air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we ingest. How do we cool ourselves in a hot and humid country? And how do we build our cities in a way that our mobility systems are also sustainable? To do any of this, we need the enablers of finance, of technology, a new drive towards circular economy, and of course, building resilience and international cooperation. So with a team of over 300 people, we are always on the lookout for new partners with whom we can engage in in-depth research and try and implement some of the ideas we come up with. So look forward to what emerges out of this conference. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So in the first section, I'm going to talk about why it matters about how India deals with the sustainability challenge more generally and climate risk in particular. And this is very much linked to the nature of economic growth that's happening in India right now. So next slide, please. As you can see, of the major regions, the United States, European Union, China, and India, India is now the fastest growing major economy in the world, over 6%, and in some years over 7%. And we have to sustain this economic growth rate of about 7 to 8, perhaps even more, 7 to 8% year on year, at least for the next 2 decades or more, in order to even approximate sort of middle income status, let alone, being a developed economy from a point of view of per capita incomes. By 2030, it will become, in dollar terms, the third largest economy, driven by that economic growth rate. So on one hand, India is now, along with other emerging economies, but sort of first among equals, India is the locomotive of the global economic engine. So what happens in India matters even from an economic progress point of view for the rest of the world. Of course, it matters for India and Indians. Let's move on to the next slide. And that's why, if we could click on one more click, please. Yes. And that's why the vulnerability India faces from the point of view of climate change becomes critical. So in a way, this is not an either or. The left-hand side map comes from the detailed high-resolution climate resilience atlas that we are preparing here at CEEW. In a way, the first of its kind in India at a high-resolution level, and perhaps one of the first of its kind in the world. What you will see is that when we map out over the last 50 years, over the last half century, the way extreme climate events are impacting India, you will see, especially if we look at the legend, the last three, there's districts that are exposed to both floods and droughts, or floods and cyclones, or in some cases, floods, droughts, and cyclones. We are basically in a situation where 3/4 of our districts are now hotspots for extreme climate events. And 80% of India's population is residing in districts that are highly vulnerable to these extreme hydrometeorological disasters. There's been, for instance, a 12-fold increase in the number of associated cyclonic events since 1970. The right-hand side graphic is even more interesting. It comes from an even more granular analysis we did of precipitation patterns over the last 40 years or so. And we see that in the last decade, compared to the previous 3 decades, there has already been a step change in intense rainfall falling in many of the sub-districts. So India has about 700 odd districts. It has over 4,500 sub-districts called tehsils. And in over half of them, there has been an increase in the intensity of heavy rainfall. And in over 10% of them, there has been a decrease. But where this is happening matters, because often these severe variations are happening both right at the beginning of the summer sowing season of the crops and exactly at the time when the farmers need the irrigation. So whether it's kind of the extreme event or the slow onset of changing precipitation patterns, it's making our economy much more vulnerable, even as the economy is positioning itself as the locomotive of the global economy. Can we move forward? So then the question arises, in trying to balance these two imperatives of driving the global economy while trying to reduce vulnerability and increasing resilience, what is India trying to do? Let's click on. And if you could click a few times, we've got a bunch. One more time. One more. There should be 5 points there. Thank you. There is something called the Panchamrit, or so-called 5 nectars, that the Prime Minister announced during the Glasgow Climate Conference. And since then, they've been sort of adjusted and explained more clearly. So one of those ambitions is to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP. Means for every additional dollar that we're generating, can we have lesser and lesser emissions? So the objective here is to have that reduction by 45% against 2005 by 2030. By 2019, we had already reduced emissions intensity by a third. So it is possible. I think we are on track But then comes more ambitious things, such as 50% of the electric power capacity coming from non-fossil sources. Currently, we've already crossed 45%. This is important, and I'll explain to you how this is unfolding. This translates into hard capacity targets. So there's a third ambition of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030. Currently, we've crossed 200 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. And for the first time ever, actually, the capacity share of coal in India in its power system has dropped under 50%. And then there is this even more ambitious story around getting to net zero emissions, in India's case by 2070. While there has been some criticism of that target year, it matters because India, as a growing economy, has not yet peaked its emissions. To give an example, the United States peaked its emissions in the early 2000s. Japan did the same. So getting to 2050 net zero for the US is a 45-year-long transition period. For the UK, this occurred actually in the 70s, as it happened for many European Union countries. So for India to peak its emissions, say around the late 2030s, and bring it down to net zero by 2070 would still be the fastest decline from peaking to net zero. Moreover, since climate change is a function of cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, despite that additional 20 years, over the last century and over the entirety of this century, India's cumulative emissions would still be 59% lower than the United States and 59% lower than China and 58% lower than the United States. One more thing India has introduced is that none of this is going to be possible unless we focus on lifestyles. So there's this national mission that was launched 2 Octobers ago called Mission Life, Lifestyle for Environment, where India is trying to position this as part of a global approach towards not just energy efficiency, but resource efficiency and a conscious approach towards consumption, which can reduce our collective footprints. Let's move forward. Now, in order to get to these, one of the things we have to recognize is in emerging economies, there's not one, but many energy transitions that are underway. The first is actually to get access to energy in the first place. When the Sustainable Development Goals were announced in 2015, India had the dubious distinction of having the largest number of people without access to electricity. So what happened, if you look at the right side panel, is that, of course, over the last 2 decades, and then particularly there was a big push around 2017, where household electricity connections were pushed out. The data is coming from the world's largest survey of energy access that my colleagues at CEEW had conducted. So you can see the steep rise in both rural and urban connections, and basically bringing it to about 98% of households that are connected. Effectively, that translates to about 130 million Indians got access to electricity just within an 18 to 24-month period between 2017 and 2019. Let's put this in context. Getting this level of electrification meant that every hour, morning, evening, night, about 10,000 Indians were getting access to electricity in a very intensive 18, 24-month period. The number of people still without access to electricity across the world, over 700 million, means that from now until 31st December 2030, when we should achieve our SDGs collectively as a whole, about 13,000 human beings in the world will have to get access to electricity every hour. So the intensity of electrification that India undertook, we got to stretch that out, not over 2 years, but over 6 years, and at a greater level of electrification. So you can imagine what was already done in India, and yet how high the hill is that we have to climb as a global community. The panel on the left shows access to clean cooking fuel, particularly in the form of cooking gas cylinders. And again, there was a big push through another national scheme called Ujjwala. And about 100 million households got access to clean cooking fuel. Now there we have a problem because we're not always what is called fuel stacking. So poorer households sometimes are using the cooking gas cylinders and refilling them, but sometimes going back to the more traditional cooking fuels. Let's move forward. The second transition, if you could click on one more time, please. Yes. The second transition is the shifting patterns of energy demand that emerging economies will face as their populations move from rural to urban areas. And that particularly is manifested through the energy needed in mobility and of course in buildings, and I'll talk about cooling later in the presentation. Now, what India is trying to do is trying to move sustainably. Urban India is already the world's third largest country by population, to which several hundred million more will come, will join the ranks. Now, currently, if you look at the bars on the top, this is coming from data that from a survey we conducted on how urban India moves. You'll see the bulk of urban Indians, their primary mode of transportation are the two legs. And then comes some two-wheelers and then come buses. The penetration of four-wheeler private vehicles is actually quite low compared to the United States, with nearly 900 cars per thousand. India is hovering at around 20. But if you look at the panel at the bottom, that's where it gets more interesting. So the world over, as we move towards electrified transport, the question is what kind of electrified transport? This data is coming from a real-time electric mobility dashboard that CEEW runs, which scrapes data from every single regional transport office in the country every couple of days. So you get real-time information of how many EVs are being sold in the country. And you can see if about 2,400 was sold in 2014, 1.67 million was sold in the financial year that closed in March. None of those is a Tesla. So you can see 93% of those registrations are two-wheelers or three-wheeler tuk-tuks. Effectively, this is about trying to move sustainably with smaller battery packs, more about public transport. That pink-colored tuk-tuk is something, it's a campaign we've been running in Amritsar city in Punjab of helping the auto rickshaw driver unions move towards electric transport. And then India also conducted the world's largest single e-bus auction of over 5,000 buses in one go. But this is going to keep increasing as individual states start moving towards sustainable public transport. So this is another pattern of energy demand as it will change. Next, move on. Click on, please. Yes. The third is to move from growth to sustainable growth. So to drive this energy system, how do we get to more clean energy capacity? And you will see whether it's wind or solar, over the last decade and a half, the solar mission began in 2010, there's been a rapid increase in renewable energy deployment. We are now the fourth largest renewable energy market by deployed capacity, not just by ambitions. And as I mentioned, it's now about 46% of installed power generation capacity. Let's move on. And then the fourth is going to be how we, click on one more time, please. How we actually think about the industrial energies part of the story. So green hydrogen is not going to be a panacea for everything, but it will be perhaps one important fuel which can substitute for coal in heavy industries like steel or cement, etc. So again, if you look at the map, the world map shows that the places where you can generate green hydrogen at lowest cost is in the tropics, particularly in South Asia or in West Asia, what you would call the Middle East. And if you look at the panel on the left, India's domestic green hydrogen mission target of 5 million tons per annum is the world's second largest after the United States and the EU's collective target. Let's move on. So if all of these things are already happening, could we click a couple more times, please? If all of these things are already happening, is a big push possible even more? Like how much more can we push? We're moving from 200 gigs to 500 gigs by 2030. Can we do more towards our journey to net zero? So this is a little difficult to understand graphic, but I would nudge you to go check our website from a study that we released just about 3 weeks ago called the Nexus study. And basically what we did was we mapped out all of India, cut it up into 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer grid. And each raster, we layered it with various types of data points, whether it's population concentration, land prices, social conflicts associated with the land, water availability. We want to manufacture green hydrogen by splitting water, of course, solar and wind potential, but also seismic risk. And when you layer all of these different constraints, we still see on the left-hand side, you see over 7,000 gigawatts of clean energy capacity that India could potentially deploy over the next few decades. Remember, it's 200 gigawatts today. 7,000 gigawatts can be deployed potentially. And on the right-hand side, you can see nearly 50 million tons of green hydrogen production can be done against the 5 million tons target that is currently set for 2030. So big push is possible despite the constraints. Let's move on. But none of this is going to come for cheap. And I'll talk about finance in a little more detail in a few minutes. But really, where the challenge appears is in the heavy industrial decarbonization. Those graphics come from 4 different studies also available on our website. The first marginal abatement cost curves that we calculated for steel, cement, aluminum, and fertilizer decarbonization. And in many of these, I'm assuming you are aware of how a back curve looks. Basically, start with the negative cost interventions. But the bulk of the emissions reductions are still likely to come from technologies that are not mature, whether it's in carbon capture, utilization, storage, or carbon removal, and so forth. The additional capex of moving towards this runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. The additional OPEX runs into billions of dollars. Not impossible when you amortize it over several decades, but still non-trivial. And therefore, strategic choices have to be made. And it opens up opportunities for cooperation with other countries that are struggling with similar challenges. Let's move forward. Now, if we recognize that India is a fast-growing economy, vulnerable, it has all these transitions that it's going through, it's set all these targets, and yet despite those targets, it is achieving a lot, and yet a big push is possible. What's going to come in the way? And this is where things get interesting, because it's no longer just about energy. It's really about international cooperation. It's about geopolitics. It's about international trade. It's about international finance. So let's click on. Could you click one more time? Yes. 3 things we see are limiting conditions right now. One, on the left-hand side, you'll see solar PV, lithium-ion batteries. The concentration of manufacturing capacity in very few countries. So the supply chain constraints will become a real one when we think of the move from 200 gigs to 500 gigs and from 500 gigs to 7,000 gigs. Those graphics show you the number of countries that have increasing concentration of countries from where they import solar PV products or lithium-ion batteries has gone up significantly over the last decade. 38 to 71 in the case of solar PV, 19 to 49 in the case of lithium-ion batteries. The top right graphic shows you something similar when it comes to the upstream minerals that are needed for the clean tech transition. 15 countries account for 55% of those identified critical minerals. Even fewer account for over 70%, sometimes 90% of the actual production and refining of minerals. And then the bottom graphic is about technology concentration. So even within the G20 countries, of which India is a member and held the presidency last year, only 5 countries account for over 85% of the clean tech patent applications and over 90% of the clean tech patents granted, none of which is going to expire before 2030. So these are, despite the ambitions and despite the action, these can become limiting conditions in the speed at which this transition unfolds in India, but of course in other emerging economies as well. Let's move on. In order to deal with this, can we click on one more time? 2 new studies we've just published. One looks at the diversification of supply chains, including positioning India as part of a more diversified value chain that emerges across the world. And the 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 bars in green are some of the individual products, rather components that where India would have the comparative advantage. Now, I want to be very categorical here. The point is not to shift concentration of production of clean tech products from one or a few countries to another bunch of few countries. The point is, how do we create a more diversified, codependent, interdependent, and resilient global value chains on clean tech products, where we look at component-wise comparative advantage rather than trying to make our individual economies vertically integrated firms trying to make everything. I think that delivers the potential for more energy security across the world and more confidence in driving the clean energy transition faster. The graphic on the right-hand side looks at something similar from the point of view of hydrogen electrolyzers production, again, a study that we just released last week, and how some of that can be potentially indigenized, and some of that is already indigenous when it comes to domestic manufacturing. Let's move forward. To do all of this, as I said a little earlier, we will need money. Now, the problem with the money story is that it's not just the quantum of money, it's the nature, it's the color of the money that matters. The first thing to recognize is that obviously, I mean, China is the powerhouse when it comes to deployment of clean energy year on year, and that's why a bulk of the global investment is happening in China. And then there is a huge amount of investment happening in the United States and the EU, not least because of the giant subsidies that are being delivered. But when you look at India, you can see a small increase in the absolute amount. But when you look at the shares of total energy investment that's going in, it's actually not changing that much compared to the rest of the world. So despite having become the fourth largest renewables market in the world, it's still attracting just about 3% of global clean energy investment. All of Africa is getting even lesser than that, as an example. Same challenge with fast-growing emerging economies in Southeast Asia. Let's move forward. So why the color of money matters is that on one hand, and CEEW as a Center for Energy Finance, which has been tracking both equity and debt finance, you can see that there are many sources of equity finance, whether sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, institutional investors, or private equity, public equity, even venture capital, and different, there are companies from within and outside India that are doing this. Let's click on. And then we see that a lot of the sovereign wealth funds or private equity, public equity is moving towards renewables. Companies with larger individual balance sheets that can leverage their balance sheets are moving into heavy capex, green hydrogen, and related industrial decarbonization. And then a lot of the venture capital money is moving towards the electric mobility for OEMs in India. Let's move on. But it's not enough just for the equity to flow. The bulk of investment will be debt. The question is, at what cost can we get that debt? And this is where the perceived risks of investing in emerging markets becomes a challenge, where the cost of finance goes up significantly and becomes the largest share in the component if you break down a solar or a wind tariff. About 50 to 70% of that is actually the cost of finance. So how do we reduce the risks, but also how do we bring in blended capital that can help to de-risk some of those investments? One of the things that India has done is created an international financial center called Gift City in Gujarat, but technically it's an offshore entity, which has an ambition and is looking to become a hub for sustainable finance flowing into India and into the region. And the objective is about $7 trillion of capital flows could flow through the Gift City by 2070. That's currently the objective. Of course, a lot more could potentially happen. Let's move on. So then I come to the last bit of my presentation. I know I've just got a couple more minutes left, and I'm going to run through this a little quickly. Let's move on. One is, how is India then projecting all of this at a global stage. One more click, please. Yes, thank you. It has taken the lead in establishing some international initiatives, such as the International Solar Alliance on Mitigation. Now it has 119 member countries, as well as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is more on the adaptation resilience side. But also this LIFE mission that we are trying to project as a global focus on lifestyles where significant emissions reductions can be achieved. Let's move on. But what more do we need? What more we need is not just the clean energy deployment or trying to build resilience. We need a better quality of life as incomes grow, as the economy grows, and people, as ordinary citizens, become more conscious of the quality of life. And I'm just going to quickly highlight these, but we can get into more details in the Q&A. Let's click on. The first, of course, is air quality. And you can see that between 2001 and 2020, there was a significant increase in the air pollution challenge in India. In 2001, 90% of the population was breathing air that was within the national ambient air quality standards. That had fallen to less than 30% by 2020. But this is not just a giant public health problem, 17% of the national disease burden. This is now an economy problem. It is impacting productivity of employees by up to 10%, even impacting GDP loss up to 90%, of 3% of our GDP. So rather than air pollution as a liability, we need to start thinking about clean air as an asset for India's economic development and growth. Let's move forward. The other thing that needs to happen, I talked about sustainable mobility. We can't do sustainable mobility unless you do sustainable urbanization. It means how you design our cities. And that's a lot of the focus that's now going to come in. We've got over 4,500 urban local bodies, etc. But many new cities will come up. And how do these graphics are coming from some public transport network analysis that we've done for Lucknow in North India. Now, how do you design public transport infrastructure based on hyper-local assessments of where the traffic is flowing, what kind of economic activity is happening, where population concentrations are, so that we don't go down the US route of everyone driving by a private vehicle, instead looking at more compact cities, which are also more sustainable. Let's move forward. A third thing is to be about water. Water is going to be one of our weakest links when it comes to climate vulnerability, but it also can drive a huge amount of economic growth when we start looking at the potential and circular economy of water. And this is some analysis that we have done across the country, but particularly for Delhi, there is, just recycling all the wastewater and reusing and retreating it. We could have irrigated about an area that is 9 times that of Delhi. About $12 billion of additional revenue could come just from horticulture that is irrigated with retreated wastewater. It just gives a sense of the scale that comes from the circular economy of a resource. Let's move forward. Similarly, agriculture. As we try to feed our population, be food secure, we also have to move towards sustainable agriculture practices. Now, again, that graphic, a little hard to read. I'll encourage you to read the report. We did the first mapping of sustainable agricultural practices in India, about 30 different practices and systems of agriculture. But you will see, if you focus closely, agroforestry, precision farming, and then things like crop rotation. There are just about 5 such practices where you have more than 5 million hectares that are following those practices. India is about 130 to 140 million hectares under cultivation. So again, a huge scope towards increasing yields while moving towards sustainable agriculture practices in a so-called Green Revolution 2.0 in India. And finally, cooling. The next slide, please. The cooling demand in India will grow about 8x over the next 2 decades, the fastest growth in cooling demand anywhere in the world. And of course, that will drive air conditioner sales and ceiling fan sales and so forth. And there are ways to make those appliances much more efficient. But I want to highlight something different. And this photograph comes from an art installation on the back of an art and climate fellowship that CEEW promoted called Sustainer. And this one artist among the many that we supported went and spent a few months with the Gond tribe in Odisha. Now, the left side of this installation you can see is an adobe mud wall. That's what their original homes, huts look like. Now, because of intensifying climate extreme events, the storms are now washing away those walls. So, the community is now building what you see on the right side, the concrete walls. Now, while their homes are becoming more resilient against climate shocks, they're actually not, because those same concrete homes are now becoming ovens. And that's creating social fissures where the men are sleeping outside, the women and the children are sleeping inside, and so forth. It's a more human-centric way of understanding what we see only in climate models and in estimating energy demand and so forth. Really, what I'm trying to say here is that if we looked at India's economic growth and its vulnerability, if we looked at everything that India is doing in already demonstrating huge capacity installation in clean energy, we looked at and solved for the constraints of technology and supply chains and minerals. We drove this through more innovations in sustainable finance, through its own leadership at international fora. Ultimately, we've got to still focus on the quality of life of citizens. The air, the food, the water, our mobility systems, our urban systems, our homes. Final slide, click on. To do any of this, let's leverage the demography of India. CEEW remains a young institution with a median age of under 30, and we've been that since we set up. And I think this is reflective of what the young demography of India can do to tackle these challenges. With those words, I will thank you for your patience and indulgence.
Thank you. Thank you, Arunabha. That was really a tour de force. I think you took us through so many topics and so many issues and raised so many things that we all need to think about. We're going to invite questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to start with the first question. Arunabha, you talked about the constraint.
Maybe we could stop sharing the screen, then I'll be able to see you.
Correct.
Yes.
Can you switch? Yeah. So the question I was going to ask you is that you talked about the constraints, the financial constraints and some of the technical constraints. But one of the other constraints, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is the implementation constraints. Because in India, back from my time in the Planning Commission, our targets were laudable and ambitious, but our accomplishments were often, there was slippage. And so that's fine. That happens in many developing countries. What do you see happening to improve capacity to implement and achieve targets?
I think that's a great question. And it also illustrates where we will feel that capacity constraint. So on one hand, we've actually managed to demonstrate that we do have the capacity to get things done very quickly and at scale. For instance, the examples I gave of the electrification program, it's no mean feat to electrify 130 million humans in 18 months. So this work was happening. I know this because our colleagues were doing the surveys, etc. This work was happening all day long, all night long. Poles coming up in the villages in the middle of the night, wires being strung, etc. It's also no mean feat to go from 20 megawatts of solar in 2010 when the solar mission began and see 80,000 megawatts of solar and 200,000 megawatts of non-fossil capacity. Where we will face the problem, right, where the kind of administrative challenge you're pointing out, is when we move from these large infrastructure things, which we seem to be doing well, into the more kind of granular stuff that will play out at the village level, at the district level, at the district town level, at the metropolis level. because that's where it's not just an individual department that is going to roll out a scheme. It's going to be a combination. It's going to require coordination at the secretaries level. It will require budgetary allocations, and it will require people on the ground who actually know what to do. I see this in two ways in particular. One, to deal with vulnerability. That's why I gave you that map of India's vulnerability. Imagine if you were, those of you who are familiar with how the Indian administrative system works, early on in your career, in your late 20s, early 30s, you become what is called a district collector. You're basically a young person in charge of, maybe 500,000 people. Now, suppose that district historically was a drought-prone district. So all your administrative, institutional memory is structured around drought relief. And suddenly, CEEW research is showing that 40% of our districts are showing swapping trends. What was traditionally drought-prone becomes flood-prone and vice versa. So you get hit by, in a desert state like Rajasthan, a flash flood. Now, how do you deliver flood relief, not on a national level, but in a district where you don't have any institutional memory of flood relief? The same plays out on the, say, the mitigation side, etc. Like suppose you were trying to deploy clean public transport infrastructure. So who is going to design the bus stop versus the pavement versus procuring the bus versus actually running mobility as a service rather than as a product? There will be 4 different departments that will be doing that. So a lot of our focus right now, when we are headquartered in Delhi, but now CEEW is working with 17 state governments. And a lot of that focus is on building that capacity to translate what the models are saying and the policies are saying into what is possible to be implemented on the ground. So no easy answer, but absolutely correct in identifying the capacity constraint. And yet, in certain ways, the capacity constraint has also been overcome, and that should be recognized too.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily instructive presentation. You mentioned at one point that India has far fewer automobiles than the US, thank God for that. You also mentioned the rather poor air quality. Now, in the 34 years that I have been traveling to London annually, I have noticed a proliferation of automobiles, and that despite the excellent public transportation system that London has. So how does a democracy like India avoid or discourage its citizens from purchasing more cars, especially those American-style SUVs that I keep seeing appearing in London streets? How does one do that? Thank you. And that's also, I think, an implementation question. Thanks.
Well, the quick answer is we are trying to follow a formula called avoid, shift, and improve. So the first thing you got to do is avoid the mobility need in the first place. Give an example. I'll give you my personal example. I shifted homes last year. I used to live in the suburbs of Delhi, and I was traveling maybe about 45 minutes to work. And in order to spend more time with family, I rented a home closer to my office, where I'm speaking from right now. But what is interesting is I can drive to work, but I can also walk to work. And I walk to work when the weather is tolerable through a forest, which has come up in an empty stone quarry. My daughter is 12 years old. The forest is about 13 years old. It's literally come up in front of our eyes. It's a 2,000-acre forest that has emerged in Delhi, out of nowhere. And it's a 4.5-kilometer walk for me, 3 kilometers of that through the forest from home to office. I give this as an example. Why? Because, as I think it was a Colombian mayor or someone said, the sign of a developed country is not where the poor have cars, but the rich use public transport. Right? So if I can first avoid the need for the transport, the mobility service in the first place. Second, shift from public to private. From private to public. So this is your question, right? This is when we design the cities in a way where it actually becomes economically efficient to use the public transport, which currently I am not. I'm either walking or using my private car. So I'm exhibit A for being at least 50% hypocrite. But that is where the marginal decision has to be made. And that's why it's not just left to the individual, it has to be on city planning. And then comes the improve. Means if you were buying private vehicles, whether it's a four-wheeler or a two-wheeler, then can it at least be sustainable? Now, when it comes to air quality, for instance, a city like Delhi, up to 39% of our air pollution is actually not coming from farm fires, which is often what is perceived as. It's coming from transport emissions. And transport emissions, not just tailpipe emissions, it's also the start-stop. The more you have unsmooth traffic, the more you're braking, that is wearing down the tires. It is resulting in more road dust, which is contributing to air pollution. So no easy answer, but you refer to London, right? So London now has the world's largest ultra-low emission zone, which was introduced last year. And even between last year and now, you have seen a precipitous decline in SOx and NOx emissions, even in London. So what I see this is like a we need to operate this as a multi-speciality hospital. There's transport emissions, power sector emissions, industrial emissions, farm fires, urban waste. Right? And this, rather than doing a finger pointing on this, if we just approach this scientifically, this is very much a solvable problem. And I think even a city like Delhi, by 2030, if it converted all its public transport and the bulk of all new vehicles being sold in Delhi to be electric, a lot of the transport emissions would significantly be reduced. We are introducing construction dust management practices that could reduce emissions, waste management practices that could reduce emissions. So even if we did not solve farm fires at all, that's over the year, that is less than 5% of Delhi's air pollution load. So we can solve more than 80% of the problem from within the city, as an example. But you've got to approach this scientifically while creating a democratic demand for clean air.
Thank you. We have about 5-6 minutes left, so maybe we can take two questions together and then you can respond to both of them.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation. So I have a question on climate finance and in particular trying to attract global investors into clean tech and renewable energy into India. So how much do you see the dominance of, say, public sector, as a hurdle to this? If there were, I was thinking if there are more private players, would it attract more investment? So that's my question.
So in India, actually, bulk of the renewable energy investment is in the private sector, whereas a lot of the thermal power capacity that was originally installed was public sector. So that is one advantage, in fact. The second advantage is that India, rightly so I believe, designed reverse auctions, starting with solar, then introduced them in wind as well, which used a competitive bidding to reduce the prices. The first auctions, we were at about 20 rupees per unit of solar. It's down to about 2.5 rupees. So 90% reduction in the price of solar. But where the public sector problem will come in is not on the who's developing the capacity. It's actually the state-run electricity utilities. And unless they are reformed in a way that they manage their budgets in a way and they're financially sustainable and the cross-subsidization is reduced and so forth. This is a more complex political economy and we are working with utilities in many states in the country to show how not only they can raise their revenue but reduce their losses. And actually the aggregate technical and commercial losses have significantly come down over the last few years. But it is the financial health of the distribution companies that often serves as a perceived barrier to investment from within or outside the country. Okay. Sorry, you had said take two questions as a whole, but maybe let's take two more questions and then I'll answer.
Okay, let's get them. It may have to be the last one. Yeah. Very quickly get to the question, please.
Firstly, it's an honor interacting with you, sir. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I wanted to ask about the Delhi situation, but you've already answered the most part of it. But my question is like, despite of several initiatives taken by the government, like the odd even scheme and the procurement of the e-buses and LPG vehicles and all that, but still the situation is like day by day kinda getting worse. And there were many, like, what do you think are the main struggle points like we are facing, and what is your point as advisor to the government of India?
I think, see, I don't belong to the government of India or any state. We are an independent research entity and we look at the data. But beyond the data, for me, the biggest struggle point is that we are in a blame game where one source of pollution is blaming another source of pollution, which is blaming a third source of pollution, right? And imagine if you were a single body and you have both a heart ailment and a kidney ailment and, I don't know, a migraine. Now you can't tell your brain, you are at fault, that's why I have the heart problem. You got to go and get them all fixed, ideally, right? And then, of course, change your lifestyle so that it doesn't come back. So that's why this scientific approach is needed. I'll give you an example. I've already talked about transport emissions, so I won't talk about that. Let's take waste, right? Now, urban waste, the landfills that we have, right, is a source of methane, etc., of course. But the burning of urban waste in the winter months, we have the National Capital Region about 100,000 night guards. Now, you can't expect those night guards to, protect us at night while freezing to death. Now, they will burn whatever they see in front of them to stay warm. That alone results in at least 7% of our pollution load in the winter months. Right? So, what do? Do you eliminate night guards altogether? Or do you do something else? So, one of the things we are doing, in fact, a bunch of school students ran a charity concert for us just earlier this week. We've developed these suits with, DC-based electric heating pads stitched into the suits, designed in a way that it's heating the right parts of the body, etc. And we are already into prototype number 6. But when we perfect this, we'll make the patents available so that regular manufacturers can make this and lower the cost. I'm giving this as an example. This is not going to solve everything, but it is the kind of human-centered approach that we need. Same thing, we do engage as part of the war room of the Delhi government to deal with the pollution load. One of our approaches, and we have a study on that on our website, we've designed this thing called the hyperlocal approach of identifying individual pollution spots. And in 1 year, we identified over 700 of them. Another year, we identified a couple of thousand of them. That allows you to identify where to target, when, how, etc. Basically, it is a patient with multiple ailments, and it needs to be in intensive care with a scientific approach, under constant monitoring, with scientific interventions. But once we start demonstrating that this is possible, I think people, you and me as ordinary citizens, not just as think tank monks, will begin to see that it's not just a story of despair, that clean air can be an economic asset for our economic growth, and we will demand more and more of this. I just urge those in the room to lend your weight towards solving the problem rather than just flagging it. And if you want to come and spend time with us or anywhere else, this is the next problem we got to solve for. We went from nothing. We were not even in the top 20 in the world in terms of renewables. And we went from nothing to the 4th largest renewables market in the world, the largest e-bus auction in the world. So there are things that have happened at scale and at speed. So let's solve the pollution problem, the air pollution problem. It's totally solvable. We need your help.
Thank you, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. That's both informative and inspiring, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. And I hope we'll have the pleasure of hosting you on campus so we can go at some of these topics in more depth. And India is lucky to have an agency like yours and people like you to guide its policy development. So thank you for your service, and thank you for making time for us late in the evening in Delhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. and look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you again for inviting.
Thank you. I mean, I think we can see here, you can tell a story of the glass half full or the glass half empty, and it's both are true. The glass is half full if you think of all of what has been achieved, and the glass looks half empty if you think of what remains to be done. So the good news is that a lot has been done, and that momentum is maintained. Then India could be part of the solution, and even be a role model for the rest of the South.